welcome to episode 4 of the Warwick Podcastle. In this episode I'm going to be talking about the Reverend James Harvey Bloom, more commonly known to his friends as Harvey. Harvey Bloom was not just a reverend, but also a naturalist, author, archivist and genealogist, although he was perhaps best known for his long-standing feud with the author Marie Corelli. Alongside his clerical duties, he did a lot of work to catalogue the libraries at various places, including Hereford, Rochester and Worcester cathedrals. He was employed to work on the Greville collection just over 120 years ago while it was still in place at Warwick Castle. I'll talk more about this work later, but first I'll start with a very brief background about his rather colourful and ever so scandalous life. James Harvey Bloom was born on the 28th of December 1860 to James Graver Bloom and his wife Moline in Castleacre, Norfolk, where Harvey's grandfather John Haig Bloom was the rector. Harvey was brought up by his paternal grandparents as both of his parents moved away after his birth. After attempting to live together for a while, his father left to elope with an old love with whom he later had a further 2 children, while his mother was left to live in boarding houses in London. Both parents were absent from his life until he was about 8 years old. Harvey's grandfather was responsible for his education and taught him Latin and Greek, which would serve him well later in life. At the age of 16, Harvey wanted to earn a living and took on a post as a teacher at Miss Billings' school in Lynn. He then went on to attend Cambridge University and studied divinity alongside his less academic interests. In her biography of him, Parson Extraordinary, Harvey's daughter Ursula Bloom describes a long string of romantic interludes that distracted him enough to stop him graduating with honours. By this time, Harvey had grown into a big man, 6 foot tall, with red hair. He was ordained a deacon on the 24th of February 1888 and took on his first post at Hertford just over a week later. It was here that he reacquainted with Mary Gardner, known as Polly, someone he had known from home. She had previously lived in Swaffham, only 5 miles from where Harvey grew up in Norfolk. Harvey was homesick, and Polly was a reminder of home, and before long he was in love. Harvey and Polly were married in September that year. Shortly after marrying, the pair left Hertford for Harwich, Essex, where Harvey took on a new post, and then moved on quickly to another curacy in Hemsworth in Yorkshire. It was here that Harvey began writing. His first book was published there on the heraldry of the South West Riding. Following the stillbirth of their first child, Polly was pregnant again, and the Blooms once again found themselves on the move, this time to Springfield in Essex. Their daughter Ursula was born in December 1892. She grew up to be a prolific author, writing under her real name as well as many pseudonyms, and it is from her works that much of the information in this podcast has come from. The Blooms didn't stay in Springfield long. In Parson Extraordinary, Ursula wrote that Harvey received a letter from an old friend in 1893. The grammar school in Long Marston, Warwickshire was looking for a new head teacher and he was well suited to the post. However, Ursula addressed this period in another of her books, Life is No Fairy Tale, stating that he had embarked on an affair with a woman called Annie Archer. She was a church worker who sorted the flowers, did the dusting, and played the organ. People began to talk after the pair were found in the organ loft and the bishop was notified. Harvey received a 2-year suspension from the church for extramarital affairs and had to turn to his only other source of income, which was teaching. He uprooted the family to take up the position at Long Marston, where he served out the remainder of his suspension. In 1894, he and Polly had another child, this time a boy, Jocelyn. Not long after, he and Polly were invited to a formal dinner which led to him being offered the post of rector at Whitchurch. The post was probationary due to his previous misconduct, and the family moved to the rectory. The village was small, only 120 people, meaning that Harvey could spend more time exploring his other interests outside of his clerical duties. Ursula wrote of another of her father's dalliances. The nurse who wheeled Jocelyn's pram had apparently fallen for Harvey, on one occasion saying to Polly, "I am as much his wife as you are." It was while he was the rector of Whitchurch that he met the Countess of Warwick, Frances Evelyn, though known to her friends as Daisy. In August 1901, Daisy had the papers at the castle inspected by the National Manuscripts Office. She was looking for someone to catalogue them, and she secured the services of Harvey Bloom. In her biography of Daisy, Margaret Blunden wrote of Harvey Bloom, "He had an unconventionality which was common amongst Anglican clergymen, whose light duties and unenthusiastic religion left ample time to develop those idiosyncrasies expected of them." Modern, outward-looking, a rebel with a bohemian disregard for appearances, Bloom frankly enjoyed life. 6 feet tall, red-headed and physically powerful with a florid complexion and amused blue eyes, his charm and vibrant personality were highly attractive to women, and no clerical considerations were allowed to inhibit his response. So far, we've only been able to locate one letter from Bloom within Daisy's personal papers here at the Record Office. The letter, written on headed paper from Whitchurch Rectory on an indeterminable Saturday, details the work he had done and outlines his best finds so far, including some missing papers from the Compton Verney deeds, a grant under the Great Seal of Henry III, hundreds of early charters of great value, a few items of Shakespearean interest concerning Stratford and Aston Cantlow, as well as some papers concerning Warwick Castle. The letter ends, "If it were not so dirty and you could spare the time, I would venture to ask you to come up to the Tower on Monday and inspect." None of these early deeds are at all properly catalogued, and in their present state, as you can see for yourself, they are liable to great damage, especially to the seals. It would not cost a great deal to make a proper calendar of the deeds earlier than 1550 and arrange them in uniform cardboard boxes in consecutive numbers as the Museum and Record Office deeds are done, but if I may explain to you in person, I should be glad. Believe me, your ladyship's obedient servant, J. H. Bloom. Harvey spent days at a time working on the documents at Warwick Castle, working up in Guy's Tower to arrange and box the collection and create a catalogue. Although he liked the work, he was not fond of the animals there and complained that the peacocks made a lot of noise and kept him awake at night. The collection had been worked on some 56 years previously in 1845 by Buck and Baker, the agents for the castle estate. Harvey rearranged many of their bundles, rendering their earlier catalogue almost unusable. He was only concerned with the earlier documents in the collection, the ones he deemed to be more interesting, and the catalogue he created is in 3 roughly chronological volumes. The first covers the medieval period to Elizabeth, Volume 2 Elizabeth to Charles II, and Volume 3 is documents created during the period from Charles II to George III. This catalogue from 1901 is still in use today and can be found in the search room here at the Record Office. Within the volumes you can see hints leading back to the earlier catalogue wherever it says an OC number. This stands for Original Calendar. The documents catalogued by Harvey Bloom can be identified by their document reference number. They have the letters BL between the collection reference and the document number. The 9,500 documents listed in Bloom's volumes are mostly deeds, charters and court rolls from lands purchased or inherited by the Greville family. He was a quick worker, although sometimes inaccurate, and there are many discrepancies with his numbering system. He packaged the documents into small brown boxes, which have been known as the Bloom boxes since their arrival at the Record Office back in 1979. The documents in these boxes were repackaged into archival boxes last year to ensure their long-term preservation. These new boxes were custom-made to make the most of the space on the shelves in the strong room where the collection is kept. Interestingly, several of the documents from the Bloom boxes found their way to the Record Office in 1940, 39 years before the rest of the collection. These deeds made their way here by way of the Society of Genealogists, of which Bloom was an honorary fellow. We can tell exactly where they have come from, as Bloom's distinctive numbering is at the top, in pen, something we would never do today, and they match the description he has given them in his catalogue. He even stamped a couple of them with his name, so we can be sure that he was the culprit who removed them from the castle. Despite this, Harvey Bloom and the Countess of Warwick cultivated a positive working relationship, which led on to other projects. Ursula wrote in the Elegant Edwardian, he adored Lady Warwick and she was very good to him. In turn, Blunden wrote, Lady Warwick probably found in Harvey Bloom more than just an efficient cataloguer of her documents. It was around this time that Harvey restarted his philandering ways. In another of her books, Life is no Fairy Tale, Ursula recalls cycling back from Warwick with her father and dropping into a little tea house to see a Mrs. Canning. Mrs. Canning and her sister Lit once stayed at the rectory for a week. Ursula spotted her father kissing Lit in the orchard, and remembers that he would kindly take Mrs. Canning her morning tea in bed, staying with her for a while with the door locked behind them. Ursula kept this from her mother to avoid hurting her feelings. But to go back to Warwick Castle, inspired by his enthusiasm for the collection, the Countess of Warwick decided to make use of the new evidence unearthed by Harvey Bloom and write a book. Blunden wrote, even though she had the congenial help of Harvey Bloom, who did much of the extra research for the book and helped to some extent with the writing, the work and the problems involved were far greater than she imagined when she began so enthusiastically in the winter of 1901. Evidence of Harvey's involvement in the book can be found in the castle's accounts. A bundle tied in a blue ribbon details the expenses he incurred while researching the book, including receipts for the photography that it seems that he organised on her behalf. He was reimbursed £50 for his work, more than double his estimate. The ribbon, which looks like seersucker, is fairly unique in the collection. We have only found one other bundle tied in a ribbon of this style so far. Wondering if there was any significance to this ribbon, I deferred to the knowledge of experts. They said that it looked to be made from artificial rather than natural fibres, meaning that it is unlikely to have dated from 1902, the date of these expenses, and was likely added later. To test this theory, I cut a small sample from the ribbon and set fire to it. The ribbon melted, meaning that it was indeed synthetic and almost certainly added to the bundle of papers years later. The Countess of Warwick's book, Warwick Castle and its Earls, was published in 2 volumes in 1903. There is no mention of Harvey Bloom's help anywhere in the book, but in the Elegant Edwardian, Ursula quotes from a letter that the Countess sent to him before it was published. It says, "You have been such a help and a real friend. Sincerely, F.E. Warwick." The publication of Warwick Castle and its Earls was not the end of their friendship. In 1904, Daisy sent for him again, this time from Essex. Ursula writes, "He had gone off to Easton Lodge to help Lady Warwick plan a flower clock. The ground was arranged to represent the enormous dial of the clock face, and each section was planted with flowers which came out at that particular hour." She wrote to thank him for his work on the 9th of July. "Very dear Mr. Bloom, the Finnish clock is really quite the most wonderful feat, and I am deeply grateful for everything that you have done with it. Have you any other ideas? I'm quite sure you will have, because you are quite a wonderful person." Sadly, from the documents we have here at the Record Office, we can't be sure if Harvey Bloom and the Countess of Warwick remained friends later in life. In 1906, Harvey Bloom went on holiday to Weston-super-Mare, and it was on a day trip to Lynmouth where he met Annie Josephine Sims. Known as Jo, she was the sister of the Mayor of Bath, and a romance began between them. Ursula, now a teenager of 14, had injured her ankle, which triggered what was believed to be necrosis of the fibula, and during the delirium caused by a series of operations revealed to her mother the secrets of her father's string of indiscretions that she had been saving her from for the last 5 or so years. By 1909, Harvey and his wife Polly had drifted so far apart that they were almost living separate lives. He had been using his position in Whitchurch as a basic income, only coming back at weekends to fulfill his clerical duties and working on his other pursuits away from home during the week. The affair with Jo hadn't cooled down, and it came to light that he had also been corresponding with an old love of his, Adelaide Marsh. Polly took Ursula and Jocelyn and moved them first to Stratford for the winter and then to St Albans, where they lived in poverty. Ursula took up a job playing the piano in a cinema to support the family, and although they had separated, Harvey and Polly never officially divorced. In Polly's absence, Harvey had moved Jo into the rectory. The official story was that Jo was his housekeeper, but it was widely known that this was not the case. Some time later, the bishop had found out about Harvey's situation and had told him that if he was to retain his living, then Polly and Ursula were to move back into the rectory. By this time, Jocelyn had left to fight in the war. Harvey arrived in Walton-on-the-Naze, where Polly and Ursula had been living, and he tried to win them back using a pork pie as a peace offering. His intention was to have Polly and Ursula move back to the rectory while also keeping Jo living with them. Unsurprisingly, the pork pie was not enough to convince them to go along with his plan. Polly had been suffering from breast cancer for some time, and she eventually died in March 1917 after her heart gave out. Harvey did not attend her funeral, and his and Jo's banns were read out the next Sunday. Ursula wrote to the bishop to tell him everything that had happened, and Harvey was suddenly no longer allowed to be a priest. He married Jo just 3 weeks later, embarking on his new life at the age of 56. 2 weeks later, the pair left Warwickshire and moved to London, where Harvey worked as an archivist and genealogist. When World War II began, he volunteered for the local fire service, putting his age down as over 60. Although this was accurate, it was somewhat misleading, as he was actually 79 at the time. He turned up for the first practice and was turned away as he had difficulty with the physical demands of the job. Ursula insisted on him being evacuated back to Stratford after his home was bombed, and he returned and took up the position of archivist to the Shakespeare's Birthplace trustees. He worked in this position until he died in 1943, aged 81. Despite not necessarily being the best vicar or husband, Harvey Bloom's work at Warwick Castle to list the early deeds and charters in the Greville collection was invaluable. This is demonstrated by the fact that his work lives on in a catalogue that is still used today and is forming the basis of the new catalogue that we are creating for this project 121 years later.